For decades, Queen Jezebel was the undisputed nightmare of the ancient world. But her reign of absolute terror has just violently collapsed. A fierce commander named Jehu rode his chariot directly to her palace gates, carrying the ultimate judgment of heaven.
Her reign of terror over this kingdom is finished. She is a poison to God's people. Throw her down!
Her own royal eunuchs turned on her, throwing her from the window. And exactly as the prophets warned, wild dogs claimed her shattered kingdom. The ancient world took a deep collective breath. The age of absolute evil was finally over. Or so it seemed. Because when Jezebel fell, the enemy had already planted a deadly new seed. A daughter. A princess named Athaliah. And Athaliah is about to do something so horrific, it will make her mother look merciful. To steal the crown, she is going to order the brutal execution of her own infant grandchildren. You are about to see how a disastrous marriage poisoned an entire nation. You will watch a hidden boy grow up in the shadows of the temple. And you will witness the most brilliant, high-stakes military trap ever set inside the house of God. Stay with us till the end to see the shocking moment a 7-year-old boy steps out of the darkness to face a tyrant. If these stories connect with you, please like, subscribe, and consider joining our Ark Builder membership to help us bring more of these epics to life. Now, let's begin. To understand how a single bride nearly destroyed the world, you have to look at the map. Generations after the golden age of King David, God's people violently divided. The empire shattered into 2 completely different kingdoms. 10 of the 12 tribes broke away and moved north. They kept the name Israel, but they completely abandoned the God of their ancestors. The north became a dark, treacherous place. This is where King Ahab and Queen Jezebel ruled. It was a spiritual war zone, filled with the smoky, violent worship of the false idol Baal. God sent legendary prophets like Elijah and Elisha up north to fight back against the darkness, but the kings refused to listen. But down in the south, things were entirely different. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, refused to leave. They stayed loyal to the descendants of King David and formed the Kingdom of Judah. The south kept the holy city of Jerusalem. They kept the gleaming temple of God. But most importantly, they guarded a sacred, unbroken royal bloodline. God had made a massive promise to King David. He swore that through this specific family line in the south, the ultimate savior of the world, the Messiah, would one day be born. Satan knew this prophecy. The enemy knew that if he could somehow sever King David's bloodline down in the south, he could cancel the salvation of the entire world. But how do you destroy a heavily guarded fortress from the outside? You don't. You get invited inside. Down in the south, King Jehoshaphat of Judah was a genuinely good man. He tore down pagan altars, sent teachers to educate his people in the law of God, and brought massive wealth to his kingdom. But Jehoshaphat had one fatal flaw. He hated conflict. He looked at the constant border skirmishes with the north, and he wanted it to stop. He wanted to reunify the shattered tribes. He wanted peace with the wicked King Ahab. In the ancient world, there were no signed peace treaties. If you didn't want a hostile nation to invade you, you married their daughter. Jehoshaphat arranged for his oldest son, Crown Prince Jehoram, to marry Ahab and Jezebel's daughter. Her name was Athaliah. It seemed like a brilliant political handshake. It meant secure borders. It meant shared trade routes. But compromise with darkness never brings peace. It only invites the darkness directly into your living room. When Athaliah unpacked her bags in the royal palace of Jerusalem, she didn't just bring her expensive jewelry and her royal servants. She brought her mother's venom. She brought the violent, manipulative culture of the north. Athaliah was a Trojan horse, and the gates of Jerusalem had just been swung wide open for her. For years, Athaliah played the long game. She watched King Jehoshaphat rule. She observed the priests of God offering sacrifices at the temple. She hated all of it, but she was patient. She knew that Jehoshaphat would not live forever. She focused all of her attention on her husband, Prince Jehoram, slowly twisting his worldview. She whispered in his ear during grand banquets. She mocked his father's devotion to God. She made him feel weak for relying on the priests. And Jehoram, eager to please his intimidating, domineering wife, absorbed every single word. The spiritual poison finally took effect. King Jehoshaphat died. His son, Jehoram, officially took the throne of Judah. The moment the heavy gold crown was placed on his head, Athaliah initiated her takeover. She didn't want to share the kingdom's wealth. And more importantly, she didn't want any of Jehoram's younger brothers challenging his authority.
Your father handed out fortified cities just to keep his enemies happy. He spent his whole life terrified of these temple priests. You are the king of Judah. You don't buy loyalty, Jehoram. You demand it.
But my brothers, the people love them. If I move against them, the governors will revolt.
Let them try. Rivals are a disease, my king, and a strong ruler cuts out the disease before it spreads. Show them what happens to anyone who shares your blood.
Under her toxic influence, Jehoram's very first act as king was not a declaration of peace. It was an act of pure, cold-blooded murder. Jehoram did not hesitate. He ordered his personal death squads to hunt down his own family. He slaughtered all 6 of his younger brothers in a single, terrifying purge to secure his absolute grip on the crown. He didn't stop there. He also executed several top officials and princes of Israel who might oppose his new regime.
I have put them to the sword. The throne is secure.
The streets of Jerusalem, once peaceful under his father, were suddenly stained with royal blood. The daughter of Jezebel was officially in control of the south. But she was about to find out that the God of David does not surrender his holy city without a fight. The palace in Jerusalem felt invincible. Jehoram sat on his throne, completely surrounded by stolen wealth, heavy armor, and his fiercely loyal guards. He believed that by eliminating his brothers, he had eliminated all his problems. But you cannot build a kingdom on innocent blood and expect heaven to stay quiet. A letter arrived at the palace. It wasn't a military report from a spy. It wasn't a trade agreement from a foreign king. It was written by Elijah, the prophet. This was the very same legendary prophet who had called down fire from heaven to humiliate Athaliah's mother up in the north. And now, his prophetic crosshairs were aimed directly at Jehoram. The entire throne room fell completely silent. Athaliah stood beside the throne, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the prophet's seal.
Give it to me! Who does this prophet think he is, interrupting my court?
Jehoram snatched the letter from the messenger's trembling hands. He broke the heavy wax seal with an arrogant, dismissive smirk. his bravado evaporated. Before he even read it out loud, the court could see the absolute terror written on his face. The letter contained a sentence of inescapable doom.
This is what the Lord, the God of your father David, says. Because you have not walked in the ways of your father, but have murdered your own brothers, men who were better than you.
Jehoram's voice cracked. He looked up, terrified. But the letter wasn't finished. Elijah's prophecy detailed exactly how God was going to dismantle the corrupt king's life, piece by piece. First, he would lose his kingdom's security. Then, he would lose his family. And finally, he would lose his own body. God unleashed his judgment upon the corrupt empire. The first wave hit almost immediately. The Lord stirred up the surrounding nations. The Philistines and the Arabians, who had been completely terrified of King Jehoshaphat, suddenly realized that Judah was weak and morally bankrupt. They formed a massive coalition and marched directly toward Jerusalem. The invasion was swift and devastating. The foreign armies breached the palace walls. They tore through the royal treasuries, carrying off all the gold, silver, and precious stones that Jehoram had hoarded. But worse than the stolen gold, they took the king's family. The invaders captured Jehoram's wives and all of his older sons. Every single one of them was taken away or killed in the raid. By the time the dust settled and the foreign armies retreated, Jehoram was left standing in a looted, destroyed palace. Out of all his sons, only the absolute youngest survived. His name was Ahaziah. The first two parts of the prophecy were fulfilled, but the most terrifying judgment was yet to come: the physical strike. Just as Elijah had warned in the letter, Jehoram was struck with an incurable, agonizing disease in his intestines. It was a horrific, humiliating condition. For 2 relentless, miserable years, the king suffered in the palace. His body literally decayed from the inside out. He could no longer wear his heavy armor. He could no longer sit on his grand throne. All of his stolen gold, all of his murdered rivals, and all of Athaliah's massive false gods could not heal a single ounce of his pain. The royal physicians tried everything. They burned incense. They offered sacrifices to Baal. Nothing worked. At the end of the 2nd year, the prophecy was fulfilled to the exact, horrifying letter. Jehoram died in excruciating agony. Scripture records his death with one of the most tragic, pathetic sentences ever written about a king in the history of the Bible. He passed away to no one's regret. Think about how devastating that is. He was the king of Judah. He possessed ultimate power and massive wealth. But when he finally stopped breathing, not a single person in the entire nation shed a tear. All of his stolen gold and iron idols couldn't buy him a single second of mercy. Worldly power has an expiration date, but God's word does not. If you know that God's plan for your future is stronger than the chaos trying to break you, comment the phrase, "The promise lives," down below right now. The people of Judah did not light a grand funeral fire in his honor. They buried his body in the city of David, but they absolutely refused to bury him in the prestigious tombs of the kings. He was entirely forgotten. King Jehoram was dead. The puppet was gone. But the true source of the poison remained completely untouched. Queen Athaliah was still standing, and her thirst for power was about to become completely unhinged. With Jehoram dead, and all of his older sons killed by the Philistine invaders, the throne of Judah fell to his absolute youngest son. His name was Ahaziah. He was 22 years old when he took the crown. He was young, highly impressionable, and completely under the terrifying spell of his mother. Athaliah no longer had to whisper in the dark. She now held the most prestigious, immensely powerful title a woman could hold in the ancient world, Queen Mother. As Queen Mother, she held ultimate cultural authority. She guided Ahaziah's every single move. She dictated his domestic policies. She chose his military commanders. Scripture gives a chilling insight into the absolute control she possessed over the young king. He too followed the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother encouraged him to act wickedly. Under Athaliah's orders, Ahaziah formed a military alliance with his uncle, King Joram of the north, to fight a massive war against the king of Aram. King Joram was the son of the late King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. King Ahab was already dead, but the wicked Jezebel still pulled the strings as the Queen Mother of the North. But the battle was a disaster.
Mother, the Syrian army is ruthless. Uncle Joram is heavily wounded and has retreated to Jezreel. Why must I leave Jerusalem to visit him?
Because you are an ally, Ahaziah. You will ride to Jezreel. You will pay respects to your wounded uncle, and you will show the north that Judah does not cower.
Ahaziah foolishly left the safety of his heavily fortified capital and traveled north. But he did not know he was walking directly into a massive military coup. While King Joram was resting in Jezreel, the time had finally come to fulfill a divine prophecy: the complete elimination of Ahab's descendants. The prophet Elisha made a highly secretive, dangerous move. He sent a young messenger to secretly anoint one of Joram's own top military generals, a fierce man named Jehu.
This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anoint you king over the Lord's people Israel.
With that holy oil, God revoked Joram's crown. Jehu was given a violent, divine mandate: assassinate King Joram, assassinate Queen Jezebel, and wipe out their entire wicked bloodline. Ahaziah, the king of Judah, traveled to Jezreel to visit his uncle, and accidentally walked right into the middle of this uprising. The terrifying, massive purge we witnessed at the very beginning of our story had just reached its climax. Ahaziah was caught in the exact same rebellion that was about to kill Queen Jezebel. When Ahaziah saw the general's treason and the violent slaughter, he panicked. He didn't stay to fight. He whipped his horses, desperately trying to flee in his royal chariot toward the southern border. But Jehu's men pursued him. They chased the king of Judah down the steep mountain passes. They struck Ahaziah in his chariot, heavily wounding him. He managed to escape as far as the city of Megiddo, but his wounds were fatal. He bled to death in a foreign city. His reign over Judah had lasted exactly 1 year. The throne of David was completely empty once again. The news of the young king's violent death reached the palace in Jerusalem.
My queen, General Jehu has committed treason. He is violently purging the north. King Joram is dead. Your mother's empire has completely fallen.
And my son? Where is the king of Judah?
Ahaziah was caught in the middle of the rebellion. He was struck down by Jehu's men in his chariot. He is dead.
Imagine the atmosphere in the royal court. Panic, confusion, absolute fear. Most mothers, upon hearing that their youngest son had been hunted down and killed, would collapse in unimaginable grief. They would tear their royal robes and weep bitterly in the dust. But Athaliah did not shed a single tear. She did not mourn. She calculated. By right of ancient royal succession, the crown now belonged to one of Ahaziah's young sons, Athaliah's own grandsons. But Athaliah understood the brutal politics of the ancient world. If one of those young boys was crowned king, eventually he would grow up and take a wife. That new wife would become the queen. And Athaliah? She would lose her title of Queen Mother. She would be cast aside. She would become an irrelevant, powerless widow in a palace she used to control. Athaliah was tired of ruling through puppets. She was tired of whispering in the ears of weak men. She wanted absolute power for herself. She wanted to be the sole, unquestioned sovereign of Judah. So she made a decision of pure, unfiltered, demonic wickedness. She looked at her own infant grandchildren and did not see family. She saw competition. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. She gripped her golden goblet, her eyes narrowing with pure malice.
Lock the palace gates! Find the king's sons! Kill them all!
She did not hire foreign assassins. She unleashed her own royal death squads directly inside her own palace. She ordered the brutal, systematic execution of her own infant grandchildren. The darkest night in the history of Jerusalem began. But in her cold-blooded arrogance, she made one massive, fatal mistake. The massacre in the royal nursery was brutal and swift. Heavy, iron-reinforced doors were kicked open. Swords were drawn in the dark. The young princes of Judah, the direct descendants of King David, were hunted down in cold blood by their own grandmother's royal guard. But in the frantic chaos of the palace, God used the split-second courage of one single woman. Her name was Jehosheba. She was the sister of the dead King Ahaziah and wife to the High Priest of God. As Athaliah's executioners swept through the royal quarters, Jehosheba didn't run away to save herself. She ran directly toward the danger. She slipped into the nursery just moments before the assassins arrived. The room was in chaos. She moved frantically, looking for survivors. And then she found him. One single baby boy. His name was Joash. He was less than a year old. Jehosheba grabbed the infant and his terrified wet nurse, dragging them into a secluded storage closet, hiding them in the pitch dark. She held her breath. The tension was agonizing. If the baby cried, the ancient promise of God would die on the end of a sword. The guards trashed the nursery, overturning beds and shouting orders before finally stomping out into the hallway. Jehosheba knew they couldn't stay in the palace. Athaliah's spies were everywhere. She waited until the halls fell quiet. Under the cover of darkness, she wrapped the child tightly in a thick wool cloak. She crept through the highly dangerous streets of Jerusalem to the one place Queen Athaliah would never step foot, the temple of the Lord. She rushed into the inner chambers and handed the infant to her husband, High Priest Jehoiada. Jehoiada quickly locked the heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary.
Jehosheba, there is blood in the streets. The Queen's Guard is slaughtering the royal house. What have you?
Look at him! She took the rest! They are all dead! If she finds him, the line of David ends tonight. Hide him!
Jehoiada pulled back the heavy wool blanket. He gasped, looking down at the wide-eyed baby boy.
The king's son, Joash. He survived. She will not find him.
The Lord promised David a lamp that would never go out. This child is that lamp.
Back at the palace, Athaliah wiped the blood from her blade. She took the heavy, golden royal crown of David and forced it down upon her own head. She declared herself the undisputed Queen of Judah. She thought she had completely annihilated the promise of God. She had no idea that less than a mile away, right behind the thick stone walls of the temple she hated, her own grandson was alive. But a baby doesn't stay small forever. And the woman who wanted him dead was ruling from the palace right next door. He remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years while Athaliah ruled the land. Joash's childhood was completely unlike any other king in history. He didn't have sprawling royal gardens to run in. He didn't have horses to ride or grand banquets to attend. His entire world consisted of the cold stone courtyards, the golden lampstands, and the heavy linen curtains of the inner sanctuary. Imagine the absolute, suffocating tension of those 6 years. To Jehosheba and Jehoiada, keeping him hidden was a daily, agonizing test of endurance. But inside the quiet, dimly lit chambers of God's temple, a secret was growing. The true king of Judah was learning to walk. He was learning to speak.
Uncle, who is the woman they are cheering for? The one with the chariots?
You must never stand near these doors, Joash. You must never let them hear your voice.
But why? Why am I the only boy in Jerusalem who can never go outside?
Because the woman in those chariots is a murderer. She sits on a throne that does not belong to her.
Then who does it belong to?
Jehoiada looked at the 7-year-old boy, dressed in a simple linen tunic, completely unaware of his own massive destiny. He wasn't just hiding Joash. He was actively training a king for a holy rebellion. Late at night, when the city was asleep, Jehoiada secretly taught Joash the true history of his family. He told him about a young shepherd boy who defeated a giant because he trusted the living God. The boy was secretly learning the sacred laws of God, while the rest of the nation suffocated in spiritual darkness. Jehoiada taught him the absolute importance of justice and the terrifying weight of the royal crown.
You see this name, Joash? King David. The Lord made a blood covenant with him, a promise that his family would rule God's people forever.
Outside the thick stone walls, Queen Athaliah ruled with an iron, wicked fist. She built towering, violent altars to Baal and corrupted the holy city, ruling through intense intimidation and fear. For 6 long, agonizing years, the righteous people of Judah wept in the streets. The priests of Baal paraded through the markets, demanding offerings and aggressively enforcing the queen's brutal laws. Athaliah had the palace. Athaliah had the army. Athaliah had the crown. But God held the true king. The nation thought they had been abandoned. They thought the covenant of David had failed. They thought the promise of the Messiah was dead. Heaven was simply waiting for the perfect time to strike. But time was rapidly running out. The 7th year finally arrived. A growing 7-year-old boy cannot be kept completely silent. He was asking too many questions. If they waited any longer, Athaliah's spies would inevitably hear a child behind the temple doors, and the royal guard would slaughter them all. Joash was old enough to stand. He was old enough to wear a crown. The time for hiding was over. The time for a holy rebellion had come. But Jehoiada was a priest, not a military general. He did not have an army. If he simply walked Joash out into the streets, they would be executed before they even reached the palace steps. Jehoiada needed elite soldiers. He needed a brilliant, flawless trap. And he needed to execute it inside the very walls of the temple. Jehoiada began to move carefully. He sent trusted messengers into the dark streets of Jerusalem, targeting 5 specific men. They were commanders of hundreds, elite military captains who controlled the most heavily armed guards of Judah. Jehoiada invited them to a highly secretive midnight meeting inside the temple complex. When the hardened commanders arrived, they did not know why they had been summoned. Jehoiada looked them in the eye and made them swear a sacred, binding oath of absolute secrecy.
We are risking execution just standing in this room, priest. If the Queen's spies see us, we hang for treason before sunrise. Why are we here? Because you swore an oath to protect the house of David.
The house of David is dead. Athaliah slaughtered the princes 6 years ago. We have no one to fight for.
That is exactly what she wants you to believe.
Jehoiada stepped aside. From the dark shadows of the sanctuary, he brought out a small, 7-year-old boy. The boy stood tall, looking up at the towering military commanders with a brave, nervous smile. The captains froze. They stared at the boy's face, instantly recognizing the unmistakable features of the royal family.
It's impossible. The boy is alive?
Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord promised concerning the descendants of David.
Tears filled the eyes of the hardened soldiers. They fell to their knees on the cold stone floor, weeping quietly. The promise of God had survived the massacre. They instantly pledged their absolute loyalty to the young king. But loyalty wasn't enough to defeat Athaliah. The queen's personal guards were stationed all around the palace and the city gates. If they noticed a sudden buildup of soldiers at the temple, they would sound the alarm and crush the rebellion. Jehoiada had to find a way to double his military presence at the temple without raising any suspicion whatsoever. So, the high priest engineered a brilliant tactical loophole. The ultimate heist. The Sabbath shift change. Every Sabbath day, the temple guards rotated. One division came on duty, and another division went off duty and returned to their homes.
On the Sabbath, the division that normally goes off duty will not leave. They will stay hidden inside. The new division will enter as usual. In one single moment, we will double our manpower inside these walls, and the Queen will suspect nothing.
It's a flawless trap. But our weapons? If we march into the temple heavily armed, her spies will notice immediately.
You will not bring weapons. I already have them.
Jehoiada walked toward the back of the massive temple armory and pulled back the heavy, dusty curtains. The captains gasped. Inside the dusty armory were weapons that hadn't seen the light of day in generations. These were not standard military issue. These were the sacred weapons of King David himself. There were massive bronze shields heavily scarred by ancient Philistine swords and heavy iron spears that had defended the borders of Israel long before the kingdom ever split. They had been stored deep inside the temple as dedicated treasures for decades. Jehoiada wasn't just giving these commanders weapons. He was handing them the physical, bloody history of their entire nation.
These are the weapons of the shepherd who became a king. Today, they will fight for his final son.
The symbolism was breathtaking. The soldiers of Judah were being armed with the very weapons of David to defend the last surviving son of David against the murderous daughter of Jezebel. Jehoiada divided the guards into 3 highly coordinated companies.
1/3 will guard the royal palace doors to prevent Athaliah from escaping. 1/3 at the Sur Gate. And the final 1/3 will completely surround the young king inside the temple. You are to station yourselves around the king, each of you with weapon in hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death.
The stakes were unimaginably high. If someone tipped off the queen, this entire courtyard would become a slaughterhouse. The trap was fully set. The Sabbath morning finally dawned. Outside the temple walls, the city went about its normal business. But inside, a quiet, hyper-focused military operation was locking into place. The off-duty guards stayed behind. The on-duty guards arrived. The temple courtyard was eerily silent. Hundreds of armed guards stood in perfect, disciplined formation. The ancient spears of King David gleamed in the early morning sun. They formed a tight, heavily armored protective circle around the massive bronze pillar in the center of the courtyard. Deep inside the sanctuary, 7-year-old Joash stood by the heavy wooden doors. His heart was pounding against his chest. He was terrified, but he was ready. Jehoiada the priest stepped forward. He took the small hand of the 7-year-old boy and led him into the bright light. Joash stepped out into the open courtyard, fully exposed for the very first time in his entire life. He stood by the massive bronze pillar, looking out at the fierce, armed men who were entirely ready to lay down their lives for him. Jehoiada reached out. With profound reverence, he placed the heavy golden royal crown of Judah upon the boy's small head. He handed the child a copy of the covenant, the sacred law of God. And then, with a loud, resounding voice, Jehoiada poured the holy anointing oil over the boy's head. For one agonizing, silent second, the massive courtyard was perfectly still. And then, the silence shattered. The guards erupted. They clapped their hands with thunderous applause. They smashed their heavy spears against the bronze shields of David, creating a deafening, metallic roar of pure victory. The priests blew the massive ram's horn trumpets, sending a chilling, triumphant blast shaking through the stone walls. The entire crowd raised their voices to the heavens and roared with a joy that had been buried for 6 agonizing years.
Long live the king! Long live the king!
The noise was absolutely incredible. The sound spilled out of the sanctuary and washed over the streets of Jerusalem like a massive tidal wave. The underground rebellion was no longer a secret. The true king had been crowned. Down in the royal palace, Queen Athaliah sat comfortably on her stolen throne. Suddenly, she heard it, the deafening, triumphant blast of the trumpets. The massive, unified roar of cheering echoing from the Temple Mount. Athaliah did not send a messenger to investigate. Her pride, inherited directly from Jezebel, demanded that she handle the insolence herself. She stood up abruptly, wrapped herself in her expensive royal robes, and marched fiercely out of the palace doors. She aggressively shoved her way through the heavy temple doors, expecting to find a minor riot that her guards could easily silence. Athaliah stepped into the bright courtyard, and she froze. There, Standing by the royal pillar, exactly where the kings of Judah always stood, surrounded by hundreds of heavily armed military guards, was a 7-year-old boy, wearing her crown. The trumpets blew directly in her face. Athaliah stared at the boy. Her mind raced. She realized instantly who he must be. She realized that her brutal massacre in the nursery had failed. The bloodline she thought she had annihilated had just resurrected right in front of her eyes. Her absolute tyrannical power evaporated in a single terrifying second. In a fit of absolute rage and panic, Athaliah grabbed the collar of her expensive royal robes and violently tore them apart.
Treason! Treason!
She screamed at the crowd, her voice echoing shrill and desperate over the trumpets. But her screams meant absolutely nothing. No one bowed to her. No god stepped forward to protect her. High Priest Jehoiada did not hesitate. He pointed a stern, authoritative finger at the screaming queen.
Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her. Do not put her to death inside the temple of the Lord.
The holiness of God's house would not be defiled by the blood of Jezebel's daughter. The commanders seized the wicked queen. She was completely broken, paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming shock of her total defeat. They dragged her violently out of the sacred temple courts. They pulled her all the way to the entrance of the horse gate near the palace grounds. And there, in the dirt, the woman who had murdered her own grandchildren for power died entirely powerless, stripped of her crown, and completely defeated by the unstoppable will of God. That very same day, Jehoiada led the massive crowd to the Temple of Baal. They smashed the altars to pieces and shattered the demonic idols into dust. The heavy, suffocating spiritual darkness that had choked the kingdom for 6 years was finally lifted. The 7-year-old boy walked into the throne room, and he took his rightful seat on the throne of his ancestors. The royal bloodline of David was completely secure, ensuring that centuries later, through this exact same lineage, the prophesied Messiah would finally be born. Evil is always loud, and it is always intimidating. For 6 agonizing years, Athaliah seemed absolutely unstoppable. But this story leaves us with a profound truth for our own lives. When you are walking through a heavy season, when it feels like everything is broken and the darkness has already won, do not lose hope, because God is always working in the quiet shadows. His promises are completely unbreakable, and the true king will always reclaim his throne. Congratulations on reaching the end of the story. You have earned the Crown of David badge. To claim your badge, go down to the comment and type Crown of David right now.
Hi everyone! These videos take many days of hard work. If you could, please like, subscribe, and consider joining our Ark Builder membership to support our mission. Also, we want to see which countries our videos reach. If you could, please comment which country you're watching from. It'll truly help us. See you in the next video.